Hello, and welcome to a brand new week on the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm your host, Joy Ravella. Hey, we are going to launch straight on into today's episode. Today, we are talking about this idea of stopping in your tracks and choosing to do something differently. I mean, what do you do when you kind of get halfway through a conversation and you're like, wait a second, I probably shouldn't be talking about this? Well, George had this experience and he's my guest all of this week. Let's get into it.
Get rid of your feelings of hatred. Don't just pretend to be good. Be done with dishonesty and jealousy and talking about others behind their backs. That's 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 1.
I've got George here with me. George is actually based in New Zealand, and it's been such a long time since I've said this, George, but kia ora.
Kia ora, Joy. Nice to be talking with you.
It's so good to be chatting with you. I mean, what a verse to look at. Now, you are the context king. I love it because whenever you jump on the podcast as a guest, you come armed with the people, place, and time, the things that happen around the scriptures. So we are going to be doing that all throughout today. So yes, definitely lean in towards that. The first question, though, George, for you is your first impression of this verse.
Just that it sounds good, you know. This one seems pretty straightforward. If I'm a Christian, I need to get rid of feelings of hatred. I shouldn't do things like being dishonest, being jealous, or talking about others behind their backs. So as I read this verse, I'm like, yep, cool, sounds good, reasonably straightforward stuff. But honestly, I think this is probably one of those verses that's sometimes easier said than done, and perhaps we'll get to that.
Yeah, I think for me, the same thing. I think we all want to be authentic, right? I think this is the thing that I struggle with this. It's being authentic, being who you are. And when you have an awful day, you still have to buck up and do your parenting, do your job. So when that part of the verse says, don't just pretend to be good, I think I do actually, I look at that and I'm a bit like, but how do I do that on the days when I'm a radio announcer and I still have to turn up at work and do what I need to do, still going through the difficult things. But I think that's where context comes in handy, because I think in isolation this verse can be quite hard-hitting, quite challenging, but there's a lot to be said around it. So George, what's the context to this verse?
Well, if we read around this verse a little bit, we actually see Peter encouraging his audience to really love each other. So just a few verses earlier, he talks about having sincere love for each other and loving one another deeply from the heart. And basically, the reason for that is because God loves us. So we need to love each other. God is holy, so we need to live holy lives. One way we do that is by staying away from certain behaviors. It's about getting rid of the sort of things that Peter is mentioning in the verse that we're looking at today. He's saying, don't do this stuff. You need to live a holy life because God is holy. We need to love others. The big picture is because God loves us.
Yes, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. So going back to, I think the thing I was struggling with a little bit earlier when reading this verse in isolation is, well, how do I just, put on a fake happy face and go on into my day? It's not that. When you look at the context, it's cemented in this overarching theme of knowing that we are loved by God and operating from a place of love and refreshing in Him. So I think that verse is so powerful because it is very hard to get rid of your feelings of hatred. It's hard to pretend to be good. It's hard to do all of those things if you are disconnected from God. And I think that's the heart of the context around this verse. It's a letter written to people, encouraging them to love each other and to love God and to allow Him to love us. And I think what that tells me about God, George, is that a huge part of our behavior and our actions line up with ultimately our identity and our core values and beliefs. And you ask any psychologist, it's impossible to change your actions and behaviors without changing your thought and your posture of your heart first. So I think this tells me about God. Tells me that He wants us to live in a different way, but He's not just giving us a list of do's and don'ts. He's saying you can do all of these things when you align yourself in the correct way, which kind of makes it a lot easier to do. That's my thoughts around what it tells me about God. What about you, George?
Well, I'll just say pretty much ditto, because I actually I jotted down some notes before we had this conversation, Joy, and you have almost said word for word, what I was thinking too. If my identity is in God, then that should affect my lifestyle. God actually wants me to live a certain way. He wants me to live a life which is characterized by love. I think as I look at this verse, it's a reminder that God does have certain expectations, if you like, of the way I live my life. He wants me to live in a certain way. And part of that is avoiding things that are unloving because he wants me to love just like he loves. And we won't go through them all in detail, but just the things that are listed in the specific verse, the problem with each of those things, with each of these behaviors, is that they are unloving. They're the opposite of actually what we do if we love people.
Right. Okay, I promise I didn't look at your notes and copy them. But it's good. It's good we're in alignment on that. But I didn't actually pick up on that. So true. All of those actions come from a place of hatred, or maybe come from a place where there is no love, which is a really interesting way to look at that. Thanks, George. I'm going to look at that verse a little differently now. That's very interesting. How has this verse come alive in your world?
Well, I said at the start of this episode that I think this is one that's easier said than done, and I'm going to put my hand up and say that I do not always get this stuff right. Trust me, the struggle is real. And specifically, I want to mention that instruction to not talk about others behind their backs. Now, as you know, I am a minister, a church minister. I'm a priest, and so I wear a clerical collar. That's like the technical term. Everyone calls it a dog collar, right? So I wear a dog collar quite a lot of the time. It's like my uniform, although I must confess I'm not actually wearing one now. I've gone with the more cash look with the T-shirt. Yeah. But anyway, I was chatting with a friend of mine about something that another person we know, another friend, had done. And as I was having that conversation, it occurred to me that I was in danger of being, let's say, a little unkind with my words. And I was suddenly quite aware of how I was dressed. I realized that I was wearing my dog collar, and I stopped. I paused, and I didn't say something about this other person we were talking about that I might have otherwise said, because, all of a sudden it didn't seem really appropriate to do so. And I guess as I say that, and as you listen to me tell that story, please hear me right. I'm not saying that ordained ministers are, some sort of super Christians who have to live differently to how other followers of Jesus live. And I'm not saying that how I'm dressed should really affect how I speak. But I guess, in a sense, in that moment, I found it a good reminder for me that actually I'm called to live and to speak in a certain way. My relationship with God, it has implications for how I act, for how I live, and that includes how I speak about others. And for me, that was a good reminder in that moment.
I think it's so interesting. I had a similar moment the other day driving through Melbourne traffic, which is crazy. And I've got a positive media bumper sticker back of my car. And I just had this moment where I was just like, I was very annoyed. I really wanted to honk my horn. And I just realized, okay, I'm actually representing something just bigger than myself. And even though I think you're talking about, the clothes that you're wearing, it's such a good example because it was a physical reminder of, oh, wait a second, when people look at you, they don't look at you as just George. They're talking to you as George, who also is a priest and a minister. And I think in the same way, we are ambassadors of Christ. And wherever we go and whatever we do, we represent him, and we ultimately are the hands and the feet and the face of Jesus in this world. And so when we do those things like pretending to be good and backbiting and talking about people behind their backs and being dishonest, people, especially people who don't really understand the nuances of Christianity and how all people are broken, what they might see is just a Christian. And this is how Christians act, and this is how Christians behave. Therefore, this is what their God must be like. This is what Jesus must be like. And so I think it's definitely a way for us to do a bit of a stop and a check and ask ourselves, okay, how am I representing Jesus? But also just another little side thing that I noted, George, you stopped yourself halfway during that conversation. And I love that you had this moment where you were like, oh, I'm not doing what I ought to be doing, and you had this moment of self-correction where you stopped yourself from sharing some juicy tea or whatever it was. Afterwards, when you held back and Like, you could have said something, you could have participated in that conversation, but you chose not to. How did that impact you afterwards, after that conversation wrapped up?
I'd just like to clarify that was one of the better times. It doesn't quite always go like that, but I guess reflecting on it, it feels good. It felt like the right thing to do. And for me, it was a helpful physical reminder in that moment, and one I perhaps need to hold on to regardless of how I'm dressed in the future.
As we head to the end of today's episode, I just love how George had this physical reminder that he was not just George, the person who's talking, but he is a priest. He's an ambassador. And now we're not all priests, right? We're not all individuals right there on the front line, but most of us listening into this podcast call ourselves Christian, call ourselves a follower of Christ, and we follow him and we follow his ways, and what we do and what we say represents him. And so 2 things I definitely want to take into our application part of today's podcast. Number 1, are you aware of the fact that you are someone who is a representative of Christ, and your words have impact? The way you carry yourself has impact. The other thing is, I hope that George's story showed you that if you are, if you're talking a little bit too much, if you've kind of fallen into a bit of a conversation you don't want to be in, you can always leave. Whether that's physically, whether that's using your body language, whether that's saying, oh, well, I don't really want to keep talking about this, and you just change the subject. There is a way to do it. I think sometimes we get into this point and we have this uncomfortable feeling, and then we say to ourselves, oh, well, I'm already here, might as well go the whole 9 yards. But actually, that is probably, at that point, that's when you can turn around and say, okay, actually, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I don't want to say this about this person. I don't want to get involved with this. And it's hard. It's so not easy to do that. But if George can do it, then we all can too. And if you've done it before, then you can do it again. And look, if Jesus modeled that, then we can follow in his footsteps, which I think is what this verse really is all about. 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 1, get rid of your feelings of hatred. Don't just pretend to be good. Be done with dishonesty and jealousy and talking about others behind their backs. Well, I look forward to catching up again tomorrow. George is going to be back. Make sure you do give us a 5-star written review and like the Facebook page. The link is in the description below. There's some incredible conversations happening over there, so be a part of it. Catch up again tomorrow.